I was keen to do, or to be able to support you with today, is really thinking through how do you start the journey on understanding your emissions in your supply chain. And I'm conscious that at CBRE, we spent a good couple of years getting our spend cube and then bringing other information to create insights. And in doing that, that took us a good couple of years. But then we were able to go and get emission factors, industry emission factors, that we could match our spend cube to those industry emission factors. And we had a consultancy that helped us for the first level of doing that, or the first time. And then the second time we had an internal expert. And so conscious that not all companies will have consultancies and internal experts that can help you start this journey. And so I was super excited talking with Luke and then Hessam around how this is already available and something that you could look to pick up as well and look to help on the journey. So really today is around introducing you to emission factors and getting a view into climatic and what they can do. And then Luke's got a great case study around how he's used that with one of the clients. And so help really give you that good understanding. You should walk away from this with an ability to do that first step of spend multiplied by emission factors, gives you hotspots, an idea of where what categories, what suppliers are causing that, and then you can start the engagement journey. So with that, let me do a couple of introductions. So Hessam is the co-founder and CEO of Climatic, a carbon calculation engine for net zero solutions. He previously has experience including leadership positions at Google and building multiple technology companies such as job spotting, an AI-driven match engine that was acquired by Smart Recruiters. Luke is the co-founder of EQUIPOISE, a specialist consultancy that helps organizations increase brand value, mitigate reputation risk, and optimize costs through sustainable procurement action. Luke works with global organizations in a range of sectors. Recent clients include University of Exeter, the Clarion House Group, and CERN, the largest and most respected centre for physics research in Europe here. The impact of these projects has been recognised as one of, EQUIPOISE was recently named the top 10 sustainable procurement consultancies by both Supply Chain Digital and Procurement magazine. So with that, introductions and scene setting, Hessam, can I get you to take us through your item or your presentations and
happy to.
Discussion?
Great, happy to. I hope you can see my screen. Thanks for everyone for showing up. It's always good to see so many people joining. Here's our short agenda for today. As Matt mentioned, Luke and myself will go through a couple of items. First of all, I will kick it off with a bit of an overview of Climatic, what we do with our carbon calculation engine, and very much focus on the data on the emission factor side and how we're working with procurement specialists and the procurement leaders in the world to help them. Then I will hand it over to Luke to jump into speaking about the common pitfalls when you're doing your Scope 3 emissions, and finally how this can be a launchpad into supply chain decarbonization and other activities that businesses take on. Cool. So with that, I will jump into a few slides I have about Climatic, kind of set the stage. So as you already know, every business leader, every enterprise today has to care about climate. It is no longer a choice, because climate change has put assets at risk. So investors demand action, and governments around the world are putting into action legislation to look into force action from businesses. This has led that carbon has become a new business KPI that companies and organizations actively need to manage. But unlike other fields like sales or HR or marketing, if you want to measure your calculations, there are very few tools available. It's very difficult. There is no tech stack. This is a completely new, there's a completely new departments that have been created in the past years. And the climate science is complex. And particularly, there are major differences between different regions and different frameworks that different organizations need to follow. And there's always a risk of greenwashing and doing it wrong. So that compliance risk is something that holds many professionals, particularly also in procurement, back to take action. So this is why at Climatic, we build a carbon calculation engine that changes the way sustainability leaders make decisions. We're using scientific data and computations. We measure, automate calculation, measure and automate emission calculations. And instead of our users having to use a new tool, instead those metrics are delivered directly into the system that they're already using. So enterprises get this within their data warehousing or internal systems. And today we partnered with a large number of software vendors that within ERP, procurement, logistics, and others that using our data and using our automated calculation engine, building new features for their customers. So they get carbon emissions directly inside the interfaces that they trust and they're used to. Today, we're going to focus mostly on the scientific data side. At Climatic, we invested a substantial amount of effort and time into building out our scientific capabilities and trust. So today, we have the largest database of emission factors globally. And to drive climate action, we offer all that data publicly and for free for anyone, any organization or any person who wants to use it. We have today roughly around 48,000 emission factors that covers the entire globe. We work with over 30 sources and data partners that I will highlight in detail shortly, and basically covering all economic sectors, including transport, supply chain, waste, IT, energy, and so on. We're working with a number of trusted data partners. Emission factors are developed and published by various governmental organizations, universities, NGOs, and we are partnering with any quality provider of that data, and we'll bring that data into our database and make it available to anybody. So this includes various governmental parties like DEFRA in the UK, EPA in the US, and many, many others, in addition to Axiobase, EcoInvent, and many others. The work we do on the data side has 3 or 4 distinct parts. Is that first of all, we partner with high quality publishers of this data. We take this data in, and our in-house scientific team spends a lot of time actually reviewing data, vetted, and actually we oftentimes find errors that we correct. And the third part is that we actually enrich this data with additional metadata. For example, with quality flags, we add additional things that we find. And the last part of it is that we publish this in an open database on our website so that anybody can access it. In addition to our in-house scientific team, we also have a scientific advisory board of some of the most known researchers and scientists across the globe that help us to make sure that we are always up to date with the latest frameworks in carbon calculation and carbon accounting, and that we continuously improve our data and the quality of calculations. Just to jump into some of the resources that you can find on our website. Our Data Explorer, as I mentioned, is available free of charge. So you can just go to our website, climatic.io, and access our Data Explorer, where you find an overview of every emission factor and every source that we have. It's a fantastic resource for anybody who's looking for any kind of data in this area. We have a great search where you can just put in keywords, or you can just browse into and actually browse through the database on your own. You will find on the left side a variety of various filters, so you can quickly find exactly based on a sector or the category that you're looking for, the data that you need. You can also filter by region. You can filter by source or the particular year. And it gives you all the tools you need to quickly find what you're looking for. So let's say, for example, you're looking for, you're based in, need to spell better. Sorry, here we go. In the United Kingdom, and you're looking for data about energy. Within a few clicks, you would get all the emission factors that you need, together with the various sources that this data coming from and across the different years. You can just click on any of those things and expand to see all the data, all the additional metadata that I mentioned that we add on top of it. So we see exactly for this particular emission factor, what the factor is. We link to the source, so you can directly actually review where this data is coming from. You can see the various type of additional data, and also a breakdown of additional factors that across the constituent gases. One interesting thing that I want to highlight is the process of vetting this data. So some of the emission factors, you will see this little yellow flag here, which is a data quality flag. As I mentioned, as we review emission factors from our partners, we look for potential errors, potential things that we believe our end users and customers will need to be aware of, and we highlight these within our database. So you can always have a full visibility and full transparency of exactly what is behind this data and how you should be using it, and what are the considerations that you need to take. If you don't know what emission factors are, very simply is every time you need to calculate the greenhouse gas emissions of an activity, you need some operational data from your business. So for instance, a purchase order, a ticket, an invoice, or any kind of activity data that you have, and emission factors, which we have been looking at. On the operational side, there are two major different categories of activity data. One is spend data. So when companies or procurement leaders may not have very detailed data about the materials that they purchased, or the weight of those materials, or the source of those materials, they might have an invoice, they might have a purchase order. That oftentimes can be the first step into getting started with understanding your emissions. One of the largest sources of spend-based emission factors is XEO-based. We have actually on our website written quite a bit about the science behind spend-based emission factors. So if anybody's interested, I would highly recommend going to our blog. I'm happy to share these links in the chat later, and actually reading through quite a lot of details about where they're coming from, what are those input-output models, and the scientific methodology that goes behind it, some of the consideration to take when using this data, and more. So as I mentioned, XIO-based is one of the largest sources of spend-based emission factors, and we actually have as part of our scientific advisory board, Richard Wood, which is one of the developers of XIO-based, that has really helped us to improve the way we work with XIO-based data and how we include that data into our various calculation tooling, such as our tooling for procurement. So we have developed a specific procurement calculation endpoint for those who are a little bit more technical, or have a technical team in-house that want to not only use the data, but actually build digital solutions on top of it, or embed it into some of the systems that they're using. So for procurement leaders, we're offering a procurement-specific solution. And what are some of the important things to take into account for using this for procurement is that particularly with XIO-based, there is a very detailed methodology of how it should be used the correct way, which means they expect the calculations require purchase prices and adjustment for inflation, and in addition to deduction of margins. And these are the things that if you're an expert or if you have an expert in-house, or if you're working with people like EQUIPOISE or Luke, they can really help you with this and to making sure that you're building this the right way, that you have trusted calculations. Otherwise, if you have a technical team, you can actually automate these things using our endpoints. And it provides a compressing worldwide coverage because our data is very global, and give you compliant, unbiased, transparent carbon insights, particularly because climatic, our philosophy is that we need to provide reliable data and no conflict of interest. So we don't work with any carbon offset providers or any partners. It's something that we are completely detaching ourselves from and really focusing on the calculation part. Just want to show you just a quick example of what a calculation, a spend-based calculation for procurement could look like. So for example, if you have spend data about a purchase, let's say you spend $400 in 2022 in United States, or let's say actually in Great Britain. Something that we offer out of the box is currency conversion. So you can enter any kind of a currency that you spend in the country of purchase and the year, and using, for example, XIO-based activity ideas that comes from our database, you can calculate the emission for that particular purchase. So in this case, we took an example of electrical equipment purchased in Great Britain for €400. And our calculation engine will give you a full audit trail. So exactly what source was used, which emission factors was used. And additionally, all the assumptions that went into that calculation. So the inflation that was applied, the tax margin, trade, and transport margins that were calculated, and all of these things are completely transparent. So for anybody who's looking to use this or working with one of our partners, EQUIPOISE, you will have access to all of this out of the box. The last thing I want to mention before...
Sorry, just going back, the inflation was one of the things that sort of we spent a bit of time trying to work out. And so that's basically for us to take back the date when the emission factor was first calculated, right? And then because a lot of the emission factors have different dates, that's the reason for the inflation. So
XIO-based, if we go back here, if you're looking at the data, the last version of the XIO-based database, it was released in 2021.
Right.
And it is based on the model based on the 2019 economy. So every time you're using that data, even though you want to measure an emission for something you spend today, it would be applied to the 2019 costs and the economy. So therefore, we have built that inflation adjustment into the calculation so that you get a compound inflation from 2013 all the way to 2019 for this particular country and for this particular sector. So we apply sector-specific and country-specific inflation adjustment. So that's why you will also see different inflations based on the year that you would calculate. So in this case, it's 0. If you would, use for 2021, you get a different inflation and so on. And so if you would change to, your spending was in Greece, you might potentially get a slightly different inflation. So this is something that you would get out of the box. You can, again, it's something that you could do yourself. It's definitely doable to calculate the compound inflation, but we have built that into the calculation engine so that you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, this is something we struggle. We end up having to use kind of a global inflation rate, and sometimes I think the EEIO that we used was like more than 10 years old, so
right.
it really difficult for us. Paul's asked a question around, is this the most recent XUA base data set?
It is. So I believe they're planning to release a new data set soon. And something important to mention is that we continuously update our database. This is why you will see we have a pretty good, it goes all the way to 1945. I don't exactly know what his emission factors are, but we always update our data sets. So for example, we just recently added the latest EPA data set, and soon we'll also release the new base DEFRA data set. And as soon as the new XCO base data is released, we will also update it. So you will, using our data or working with our partners, you also ensure that you will always have access to the latest model, which is obviously save you a lot of time so that you don't have to continuously bring that in yourself.
Right, thank you.
Just one last thing I want to mention before handing over to Luke or looking at other questions is that this data is, as I mentioned, available for free for internal use and for non-commercial use. So your team, your organization, when you're looking to measure this for your company, you can definitely use this. You just go to our website, climatic.io, and then click through our data set. You will have to create a free account so you can actually get more access to all of the search features that I just mentioned. But this is all free of charge. And additionally, if you're looking to advance and you're looking to build a new solution, a digital solution, embedding these calculations into your software, you will work either with one of our partners or you will have access to our API docs, working with your product teams and engineers to build that in. We have developed quite a lot of content around this. So one was about the science of spend-based emission factors that can be very interesting if you're keen. We also written quite extensively about our methodology. So all of our calculations are transparent and our methodology is published on our website. For example, the difference between basic price or purchaser price and what they mean and how to actually calculate it. All of this is accessible into our guides. We have written a number of guides, not only on procurement, but actually on other emission activities. So I would highly encourage you to just browse around, look at our guides, look at our various content that we provide, and I'll be happy to share some of these links in the comments so you can easily find them.
Perfect, thank you. Was it Gentha? You've got a question around the climatic where it include only spend-based emission factors or industry average emission factors. To me, they're pretty much the same, right? The industry emission factor is normally a dollar amount, and so you multiply the emission factor by the amount of dollars you have in the spend, and then that calculates that. Is that?
Yeah, I think that sounds right. So we have emission factors both for spend-based and also activity-based. So if you have the more precise data you have, so if you know the weight and the distance of travel or the weight of material you purchased, you'll obviously get a better emission estimate. But of course, spend-based is usually oftentimes the first step and the easy way to get started and understand your hotspots. We offer spend-based, we offer activity-based, and soon we also offer supplier-based emission factors.
Perfect. Thank you.
If there are no other questions, I will hand over to Luke. Take it away.
All right. I will have more time for questions at the end, but thank you for that, Hessam, and for the introduction as well, Matt. So I'll just do a quick introduction to Equipoise for anybody who doesn't know who we are, before continuing with the theme of talking about common pitfalls when doing spend-based emissions. So just a quick summary, as Matt mentioned, Equipoise help organizations increase brand value, mitigate reputational risk, and optimize costs through our sustainable procurement consulting services. On the left-hand side here, you've got a few key things about that. We are specialists in sustainable procurement. This is 100% what we're focused on. We're also very much hands-on delivery, so we're not an organization that just creates strategies and analysis. We do actually roll up our sleeves and help our clients reduce, say, for example, their emissions or make actual improvements in other areas of sustainability. We also let technology play quite a deep part in that through partnerships with organizations like Climatic, but also through the development of our own proprietary carbon accounting platforms and supplier engagement platforms as well. Although today we're talking about carbon emissions, it's probably important to note that we do look at sustainability a little bit more holistically, and we have a mission to rebalance our planet and society through sustainable procurement action. I think this mission is quite nicely summarized and also inspired by this donut economics model by the economist Kate Raworth, which shows the different ecological and social issues that our planet is facing. And our mission is to get us inside this safe space for humanity. Would really recommend checking out this model. It's inspirational work. How do we do that? So we have a range of core services that we deploy to our clients. So first one, supplier engagement, often the first step when a lot of organizations have figured out what they need to do in terms of sustainability. They realize that their suppliers have a huge impact on their ability to act in a sustainable way. So step one is engaging those suppliers in a constructive way. We also focus a lot of work on decarbonisation, which we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. Firstly, helping organizations measure their Scope-3 procurement emissions, but then also, as I said, actually giving them help to reduce those. We also support organizations with the internal capability development side of things, focus specifically on the procurement team, helping organizations develop their sustainable procurement skills, systems, policies, and processes. And last but not least, we also offer digitalization services. So we help matchmake organizations with leading digital solutions as well, where that is not in our own capability wheelhouse. So yeah, that's a little bit about Equipoise. And then, as I said, continuing on the theme of spend-based emissions measurement, I guess I firstly wanted to summarize this from a procurement perspective on the left-hand side, and try and give you the problem question that most organizations have when you begin this sort of analysis. And it's typically, when I speak to CPOs, it's what portion of my total footprint results from the procurement of goods and services. And the spend-based method that we've been talking about is actually a really good first start for that. There are different ways to measure the emissions of your purchased goods and services. Spend-based method is step one. All you need to do that is really procurement spend data. As I think a few people have already highlighted from the questions and the comments, they've alluded that they have maybe done this as well with actual, say, PO data, where you're inputting material volume or distance traveled, and using slightly different types of emission factors for that, still published by the same types of organizations. You can also look at going specifically to your suppliers and saying, what are your total emissions, supplier? We will then take a portion of those emissions based on your revenue and our spend with you. So you're kind of going up in each step in terms of emissions granularity with those different approaches. But I think this session is really about spend-based method and the best place to get started. So Hessam talked a lot about pitfalls as it relates to the quality of emission factor data, but I want to start with talking about the pitfalls when it comes to the quality of procurement data. Now, I have a background in procurement cost reduction and transformation consulting, and I'm well too aware that the master data of organizations sometimes isn't quite up to scratch, and those procurement categorizations don't always actually accurately match what the supplier is really doing So I would say from a procurement perspective, the first thing that you need to do before going through the spend-based methodology is just making sure that you've got a really accurate procurement taxonomy for, say, at least the top 80% of your suppliers. We appreciate that in the tail, it's a bit of a no man's land, but for a majority of your spend, you should have a really clear procurement taxonomy. And what that will do is help you align procurement categories to those emission factors, really. And I've just included on the right-hand side kind of fields of data that really you would need to do a meaningful spend-based emission analysis. And I just want to hand over to Matt quickly, as he has an insight for what you might want to do if you can't exactly match your procurement category to an emission factor. If you'd like to share that, Matt.
Sure. Yeah. That procurement data is like a massive challenge. And so I was just putting in the notes there that we spent the first 18 months just trying to get our spend files together. We have all the different ERPs or finance systems you can think of. And so now 65 data files come together every month to calculate our spend cube. So it's a real challenge. And so what interesting research that we've done or experience I've had working with EMITWISE is that we initially were thinking that if you couldn't find an emission factor the same as your procurement taxonomy, then you just find something similar. So, you know, if you can't find professional services, you just go with legal. But what they've actually found going through the process is it's better to go up a level. So instead of it being like swapping professional services to legal, you go up to like business activity as an example. So I think that's quite useful to know that as you're trying to map your procurement taxonomy to these different industry emission standards, because they aren't a like for like, that you want to just kind of think through some of the elements and go up that upper level rather than trying to find something similar. Thanks, Luke.
That's all right. Excellent. And then just a couple more common pitfalls. Hessam touched on this one in a reasonable amount of detail, but I'd just like to clarify as well, the application of XIO-based emission factors has, to our knowledge, not really been done correctly until Climatic took the time to properly engage XIO-based and ask, should we be multiplying spend by the emission factor that you have reported? And unlike with any other emission factor database that uses that spend-based approach, they said no. Now, XIO-based is probably the best spend-based database for organizations that have suppliers across multiple countries. If you're aiming to use a single data source, which would be probably sensible if you're trying to explain to anyone how you've calculated your emissions, because it just has that global coverage. So this is a really important thing to highlight. In terms of how you, a procurement person or a sustainability person, can try and underscore a new carbon accounting provider or your colleagues in carbon accounting are correctly applying this, I would suggest some of these following questions that we've noted down on the bottom left-hand side. Really, you should be able to get an understanding of what emission factor database they're using. Climatic has tons of excellent information on our website about these different emission factor databases, some of the pros and cons of them as well. But it's quite digestible for people to understand. You've got to really ask carbon accounting providers if they're using the XIO-based emission factor database. Are they using the basic price, i.e. just the price that it says on the invoice, or are they stripping away the trade and transport margins that Hessam briefly explained as well? Also, Hessam said that it's relatively simple and you can do it yourself to strip away inflation. I've tried. It's really difficult, very confusing. You end up with a very big, messy spreadsheet. So certainly worth asking your provider to explain how they have accounted for inflation versus the base year of the emission factor database, and also how they've dealt with exchange rates over that period as well. because you have to both consider the supplier country of origin, the currency you purchased in, and yeah, that difference in inflation as well. So that's a pitfall. Got to say, it's certainly overcomeable, and the way that EQUIPOISE has overcome this is by partnering with Climatic, who fix all these problems for you, which is excellent. Last thing, and probably something that you'll be familiar with if you tune into Sustainable Procurement Pledge webinars recently a lot, is a common pitfall is kind of delaying action in a quest to get more and more granular data. And by granular data, I'll just try to flick back. So I mean going up this pyramid here and really trying to get the perfect data for every single good and service that you buy. What I would say is instead, start with the spend-based method. That's going to give you a really good overview of where your emission hotspots are, i.e. who are your most emitting suppliers, which categories of spend cause the most emissions. And that will allow you to start focusing your attention on those categories and suppliers. Just an example here again of what that might look like. So as Hessam mentioned, they don't have a front end, but we plug their data and our clients spend into a BI dashboard. And you can see here that you can get a quite nice breakdown of emissions per category, per subcategory, and per supplier. And that really helps inform conversations with your procurement team and your sustainability team. Say, okay, these are the suppliers we need to talk to about our decarbonisation objectives, and then get them to help us on our journey. Great. I'm sure there's lots of questions, so I'll pause now, 20 minutes to ask some. Yeah.
I think they're being sort of answered as we go along. But one of the questions that often comes up, Luke, that I get is around the LCO, the life cycle analysis, and kind of the EPD, the product level information. People assume that it's so much better than spend, but often there's spend-based emission factors in that as well. Can you spend a couple of minutes like just talking people through around, you sort of mentioned it, saying to start with your spend, but if a supplier does have that information, should you use it, and how would you bring it in?
Yeah, let me just refer back to this pyramid as well. So if a supplier has LCA data and they say, okay, your Apple, and for this M1 chip that you are buying, we, the supplier, say Foxconn, that actually supplies it, have done a full LCA on all of the materials that go into this M1 chip, and here is your exact emissions, then yeah, that will be more granular than just going to say, okay, we're working with Foxconn in China or Taiwan, and on average, a semiconductor producer in that region has emissions of X per dollar spent. So if your suppliers do have that information, then that's fantastic. However, I would say if you are an organization, say a construction company, and you're building homes and you've got offices, then a first step would not be to go to every single supplier and say, can I have a life cycle assessment for everything that we buy, from the concrete to the pens to the Lenovo laptops. The spend-based approach would probably lead you down more of a path of saying, okay, we recognize that a majority of our emissions are from construction. Within that, we see that a majority is from concrete. Let's maybe start by going to our concrete supplier and saying, do you have any more granular data about what emissions are per tons of concrete? Maybe they can provide some industry average for that type of concrete in the region that they produce it. And then maybe even better, they can actually say, well, we're going to get a life cycle analysis consultant into our production facility, and they will precisely measure for this blend of concrete that we are using for you. These are the emissions per ton there.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. It's an interesting one. So CBRE has a significant investment in a company called Turner & Townsend that does a lot of construction, and they've actually added using one-click LCA the data into their cost modeling. So when you want to develop a building, you know, they can go and say, well, this is all the cost with all the materials, and this is all the carbon you're going to be doing. And you can shift then, you can't shift between suppliers, but you can shift between products. So if you use this type of concrete that has this amount of ash in it, then it reduces it down, and you can do a bit of scenario planning as sort of one use case. But otherwise, I've always found that technology hasn't caught up to this, right? That say you have a couple of your suppliers with the LCAs, and it will only be a couple of your suppliers, then how do you bring that data in to the overall baseline of everything else? Unless, you know, it makes sense if you're doing raw materials or direct procurement, and you're like Heineken buying tons of glass or Unilever buying tons of coca. But if you're looking at the indirect, where you've got thousands of suppliers, millions of SKUs, you need some technology to help. And unfortunately, you know, the procure-to-pay platforms like Cooper aren't there yet, which is sort of plugging a previous session we did where we had Emitwise talk about what they're doing a bit more on the spend side, and then CarbMe, which was doing a bit more on the product side, but two platforms that you can use that will ingest all of your data and then come up with an overall baseline that you can then manage down. So that was a previous session we ran. But I think this one is perfect around where do you start? How do you kind of use the data that Climatic has to calculate your first baseline, and then you start trying to improve it, and then you realize that it's all a journey. There's a question from Ian around, and Ian, I don't know if you want to come off or and ask it, or Hessam, if you want to have a look around.
Yeah, I was just typing. So maybe to repeat the question, it's about inflation, applying inflation. And the question is, if the price paid already has the inflation in it, clearly, how should I think about it? I'm happy to take it unless Luke want to do it. But the main thing to consider here is this is a very complex process, and it's not a dumb question at all, as you mentioned, Ian. It's actually very complex because XIO-based emission factors are based on the year 2019. So whenever purchases happened after that year, the price you paid in 2022 has to be reformatted based on the inflation that was applied, compound inflation since then, for the particular sector that you spent in and the region that it was spent in. So there's many different things to take into account, but the complexity comes from the model that XIO-based is based, that has been developed by the 2019. The next time they release a new model, which let's say 2023, for purchases in 2023, you don't have to, the inflation will be zero. And in 2024, we will have to look for the particular sector, how much inflation was for that particular sector and region, and apply it accordingly.
So my thinking or understanding on this is that at one point in time, exactly, that they calculate the entire emissions for an industry and what the revenue is at that point in time for that industry as well, and then you divide the emissions by the revenue, or and that comes up with emissions per dollar. And so the inflation then is recognizing that if it was a couple of years ago, the overall revenue in the industry would have gone up, but the emissions should have stayed around the same, or potentially wouldn't have gone up as much, right? And hence you're trying to match it back. Is my understanding completely off, or does that make some sense?
It really has to do with that, that you would probably, so there's two parts of it. Is the inflation is one major part. The second point is actually all the margins, the trade, transport, and the taxes. And those also something that you need to take into account. But you're right that the value of what you spent, the value and the monetary input and output model that the spend-based emission factors are based on change year after year because of the inflation. And to have an accurate metric, an accurate estimate, you need to take that into account. Otherwise, you actually you typically overestimate your emissions.
And just to add on to that, we found that if we applied the incorrect just money spent times by Xyobase emission factors, there was an overestimation of between 10 and 20% with the clients we've worked with in the past 12 months. So essentially, you're overstating your inflation, your emissions, and given that procurement emissions typically make up around 80% of total footprint for some organizations, that's quite a big overestimate for the whole organization.
Yeah, so we actually find, Luke, that with the work with EMITWISE, our batch one of 325 suppliers, and we had that we engaged 98 that went through the process. When we looked at the emission factors versus their actual emissions that they come, so you calculate their scope 1, 2, and then purchasing in scope 3, it was 50% less. But this is on average. And so we had some that were like well under, like we had a catering provider that was 98% lower, and we're like, got to check that. But when we included our clients in that, some clients, their emissions went up and some went down. And we found that as well in some of the others, that some suppliers were higher than the emission factors, but most were lower. But you can't use averages, right? You need to know a bit more than that. And that was actually something that we talked about previously when we were prepping for this call, right? We talked about outliers, and that you kind of, at least our recommendation is that you remove some of the outliers that are skewing your data, and don't be worried about doing that if you're kind of looking at an overall baseline. But yeah, definitely you should expect that there'll be some strange things that come in, and you should be reviewing that. And Luke, you did that as well, right? You removed some of the outliers.
Yeah, for sure. In both the spend data and also using those data flags that Hessam mentioned with the emission factors, that's a really useful exercise to say, because we've moved country, sometimes emission factors are significantly different between two countries, even though they border each other and have broadly similar energy mixes. So there are some oddities in there that you need to look out for.
Jennifer, you've come up with a really interesting question around what is the best and most reliable place to find sector-specific and country-specific inflation rates. We couldn't find them. I think this is the great thing about Climatic is that they've already calculated it through there. For us, we had to go for a global average around inflation when we calculated it initially ourselves. So it was massively out. But you kind of like, you've got so many elements that are quite can be quite far out that you kind of just think, well, on average, it should be right. So I think maybe what we need to position that this is the way you start, and you provide insights with your more accurate spend cube against emission factors. It highlights the categories, it highlights the suppliers that you want to engage with, and then get more activity-based information, either through LCOs or products or through their actual emissions. And then you start on the journey. And I see this as to decarbonize your supply chain. It's both a data journey that we're talking about here, and it's also a supply engagement journey. So for CBRE, we take the data because it tells us, one, the maturity level of our suppliers, and second, where their emissions are. So their emissions half of it might be in scope 1 and 2 in their high maturity, in which case it's an easy conversation with electric vehicles and renewable energy, and maybe 1 or 2 product changes, or they're low maturity and the majority of their emissions are in scope 3 and purchasing, and then that's a lot harder conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I also added links to our sources for what we use for those calculations. So it's World Bank and the European Central Bank. Again, like we spend a lot of time going through this data and mapping it to the various sectors and countries. It takes several days to set it up, and it also doesn't cover the entire it doesn't cover all sectors and all regions, but it's definitely a good start.
Awesome. And there's another question from Federico. Do you want to come off mute and ask that yourself, and anyone else with other questions, or Federico, do you want me to ask it? Oh, the question is, carbon emissions might change thanks to technical or technological evolution of the product and product category. So carbon emissions are changing all of the time, which is why the emission factor dates is important. Is it kept in any considerations in the system?
Yes, so emission factors, the major sources like BASE or EPA or ADEM, they typically update once a year, and they update because of the evolution in the economy. As our grids get greener, our production of materials and products ideally get less polluting. So emission factors change accordingly, and emission factors that we provide for various years, then all of this data is versioned. And so based on the year that the spend happened or the activity took place, we'll always make sure they use the right emission factors. But Climatic, we aggregate this data and we vet it and we make it available. We don't actually develop the emission factors ourselves. We reflect the governmental sources and the quality sources of emission factor data out there, but we don't actually develop them ourselves as such.
Great, yeah. So for CBRE, our view is that there's 4 main net zero pathways. So one is really around the energy, and so what can you change on that? Another one is around transport. So electric vehicles, hopefully charged off renewable energy, and then of course buildings make it a big impact. It's about 37 to 39% of global emissions come from buildings, and then procurement. So those are the kind of what we see as the 4 net zero pathways that you should be looking at, and so all of those can look to change, and they would change the emission factors, and those are the kind of 4 areas that you can talk to your suppliers about as well, right? Around what are they doing in those areas to look to improve, and that will change their specific company emission factor too. Perfect. I think that's all the questions, unless anyone else has anything to add or to ask.
Hi, John Paul Dignan here. Hi, guys. Very interesting, and thank you so much to all of you. My question relates to where you're finding the sort of organizational knowledge. We talked about procurement. I think there's a little bit of talk about the IT and technology. Like, is it within sourcing, within IT, within risk? Where are you finding the skills and capability in order to, to build the strength to actually go after this? Because clearly it's a data challenge. So where's the organizational fabric being built?
John, do you mean in terms of measurement or in terms of driving action for the suppliers?
Well, in terms of measurements in the first instance, I think that's the sort of the...
Perfectly honestly, sometimes nowhere. It's a very new topic. I mean, if I speak to directors of sustainability, their team has been lifted from 10 years ago being responsible for recycling bins and waste management contracts into this whole world of
major transformation, and it's like
XYZ.
Yeah.
Maybe Matt can speak more to where they found it at CBRE, but yeah, it doesn't often sit within the procurement team either. If I look at the SIPs, global standard for education, this is not featured right now.
Yeah, so I'm kind of unique in that 20 years ago, I got a sustainable development master's through Imperial College in London. So I've always been interested in this sustainable procurement, but had this as a side job. And so to back up Luke's comment, I'm not finding much, it's certain companies, but mainly it's not coming out of procurement, the thinking on this. Often it's coming through the sustainability teams who then calculate the baseline, who then realize that it's a lot about procurement and then start engaging with procurement. So it eventually comes to procurement. And there's some interesting survey coming out soon that I've provided comments on, because I think procurement should be pushing the organization to have their Scope 3 calculated. But as soon as they do that, procurement's going to be like, well, all the leadership will realize that it's sitting with procurement. And so that then helps you with business cases and engagements to do that. And there is a lot of recruitment at the moment of sustainable procurement folks happening through Europe, but little less in the US. So procurement teams are realizing this. And actually, a plug for next month is that we're going to run a session where CBRE will explain the business case we put together in the last year to get funding to be able to build a decarbonising the supply chain program, including staff. And so, yeah, that'll be on the 20th of September. It'll come out soon. But yeah, so it's a good question, Paul. It's and echoing Luke's again. It's so new. It's not really coming from any one area.
Understood. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Well, that was a great last question, and we're at time. Thank you, Luke, very much. Appreciate your time. Hessam as well. Is very insightful. Great session, and thanks everyone for attending.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, everybody.